Will Monster Hunter reintroduce swimming back into the franchise? What's up guys, it's the Hunter Project here, welcome to my channel where you'll find Monster Hunter news, builds, playthroughs and everything in between. If you haven't already, if everyone watching could smash the like and subscribe buttons, it would be extremely appreciated, of course assuming that you enjoy the content, as I am trying to reach 1000 subscribers as soon as possible, ideally by the end of February tops. Yes, that may seem a tiny bit high, but I'm a keen believer of speaking things into existence, so we shall see. So underwater combat and swimming in general has been absent from the series for quite a while, and was last seen in 3 Ultimate when it was first introduced with Monster Hunter Tri. I believe the community was roughly split 50-50 in terms of who liked the aspect and who disliked it, and I'll try split the bulk of this video into positives and reasons it should have stayed, and then reasons as to why it was considered a poorly implemented feature of the 3rd generation. So the main reason it was loved was due to the amount of depth it added to the world around the player, and the immersion in general was also amplified with the ability to dive into the water and swim around, of course fight monsters in the water. That makes sense, as obviously if there's a water monster it kind of feels a bit unrealistic that we fight them just on land, especially if they are most comfortable in the water, so it just created more of that immersive feel. The fact that we were given an invisible wall in every other game when we were trying to chase the Plesioth back into the water was always an immersion breaker and annoying, as we had no other way other than trying to fish it out while it kept on shooting its water blasts at us, just so we could wait until it returns to the land. With water combat we were given the option to chase the monster when needed, and still had the option for monsters like Gobble and Plesioth to force them onto land. At least of course Gobble, it did depend on the location you were at when you were in the flooded forest, but nevertheless we did still have the option there depending on our circumstances. It added extra depth to other monsters like Royal Ludroth, who would start on land and then retreat back to its water territory when injured, and in addition it also opened the gate extremely wide open in terms of monster potential, one of the greatest examples being Ceadeus, who was an Elder Dragon tied to the story of 3 Ultimate. This monster had an extremely original idea and design, and not to mention the soundtrack, it was so damn good and iconic. Another reason many people believe the underwater mechanic was justified is that realistically an aquatic monster should theoretically have the advantage when underwater, so that kind of counteracted all the points about underwater combat being too clunky and slow and difficult at times. Of course this is pretty much a given and it does make sense, but that doesn't mean the gameplay should be unenjoyable due to realism, because this is Monster Hunter. It's not exactly the most realistic game. We are swinging around giant swords non-stop like we are Hercules or something, so yeah. On the contrary, there are many issues players had with the underwater combat, and one of the biggest ones being, just as I mentioned, how clunky some of the weapons were. Prime example being the hammer, which was very hard to use underwater compared to other weapons like the lance and greatsword, which made up for the clunkiness with the ability to guard, which means you could tactically time your guards to maintain DPS on the monster, and of course especially with like greatsword you had a lot of range, whereas a lot of players had difficulty being able to judge the range. I myself remember having a lot of difficulty with the sword and shield specifically, just as it was such a small blade, and the shields obviously they're extremely close range. Sometimes it was hard to judge the distance when you're fighting something like like Gearchris, where the tensions are high and you're having to worry about being extremely close to the monster as well as trying to get to it and dodge it at the same time. So there was a lot of things to take into account, and the fact that a lot of the weapons were clunky just did not help solve that issue. The other issue many had was the camera control not being well fitted for the 3DS, which brings me on to the point that I believe many of those who had an issue with the water mechanics were 3DS players, so their smaller screen and controls made it a bit more of a challenge, whereas Wii U players were able to take in what Capcom hoped to achieve with the water mechanic more. But of course, this still doesn't take away from the fact of how the mechanics worked in the water, regardless of how the camera worked. So I'm sure it did cross the mind of each game's developers since 3 Ultimate whether they should include water combat, and I'm sure it will make its return one day. One of the main issues that they can easily fix is the underwater clunkiness, which of course makes sense as we shouldn't be swinging around our weapons underwater with ease, but there are ways they can make it a bit more accessible. One of the ways I can think of is allowing for a lot more combos and moves to traverse the water more effectively using the wire bug or even clutch claw, if they could implement a way to have things in the water that you can pull yourself around with, so then you don't have to be slow, like you can go from a combo and then pull yourself to the right or pull yourself to the left or up or down and so on. Both of these have capabilities to allow us to extend or close the distance between us and the monster, and maybe they could even implement a move that allows us to rotate around the monster. Like, of course, once again, wire bugs would be perfect for this, or they could add something called a water bug or something that obviously will come to the hunter when they enter the ocean or the sea or whatever water area they're in, and this would allow them to be more agile in the water without breaking the realism and having the hunter be able to swim with a greatsword at 10 miles per hour. So the other complaint of the camera is pretty much non-existent now, as we do have dual analogues for all the consoles that the current Monster Hunter titles play on. Another way that they could avoid a flop of this mechanic, if it did return, would be if they made the damage relative to when you're underwater. So, for example, if they did have to make the combos slower and less diverse, which of course they can still make diverse at this point because they've got a second chance to do it, but they could make the damage a tiny bit higher when you're underwater, just to compensate for attacking slower. So at least when you do land your hits, they are hitting harder than if they were on land, where you can easily attack really, really quickly. So that's one way they could possibly fix that issue of how slow and clunky it can feel, and of course that leads to just slower monster kill times. But of course, I'm sure Capcom will look into this extremely well when they do end up bringing it back to the franchise, as I'm sure they are aware of the amount of backlash Underwater did get, and obviously it's pretty obvious they did take account of it, as they haven't reintroduced it since. But hopefully we do see it in the future, and I hope it's really revamped. I'd just like to end this video saying that water traversal and combat in Monster Hunter was never objectively bad, but of course it was really flawed with various little tedious issues that made it unnecessarily hard for the player. I've said this since day one of playing 3 Ultimate, and still to this day. I'm sure they will eventually reintroduce the feature into future games. However, it is going to be a challenge for the developers, as it can be a time sink to animate all the new moves underwater and think up all the different ways they can fix what went wrong in 3 Ultimate. We of course will not be seeing the feature in Rise unless they drop a massive surprise bomb on us by not showing it via the marketing. But regardless, I think we will see it return. If you did enjoy the video, guys, if you could smash the like, subscribe buttons, it would be extremely appreciated as we make our way to 1,000 subscribers. Let me know down below how you think they can fix water combat and when you think it will return. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.